I suspect that Vladimir Putin will only negotiate with the United States. So I think it's less a matter of whether or not Donald Trump is including or not including the right people. I think if there is to be a negotiation settlement of this war, it really has to be a U.S. Russia negotiation. That's not to say that at some point in these negotiations there can't be, and I would anticipate that there will be additional voices. But I think, in some sense, to kick off these negotiations, this really has been a proxy war between the United States and Russia for all that Europe has done. And I think that's if this is going to be wound down, it will have to be, at least in the first instance, a negotiation between those two principles.
I want to start by asking you about the tone that this new American administration seems to be taking. It feels more confrontational, it feels more prepared to say the quiet things out loud. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the administration has made it clear that the sort of status quo that has existed for over 50 years, 75 years is no longer sustainable, both as a kind of a financial defense set of commitments, as well as the United States and its focus moving especially toward Asia. So, yeah, I think it is intentionally seeking to wake Europe from its torpor.
And obviously, the way that it has been interpreted in Europe and the UK is a break in that kind of transatlantic partnership that I think Europe had come to rely on for quite some time. The UK too, to an extent. Is it fair to interpret it that way? Is it a break? Is it a shift? How would you describe it?
Yeah, I think it might feel like a break because it does represent a real change, a proposal, and I think what will be a change in the relationship. I do not think it is. It represents a kind of formal declaration that the United States will have nothing further to do with Europe, or that somehow we should consider ourselves to be no longer friends. I actually think the position of the administration is that if and when Europe is capable of, in a sense, standing up much more on its own, particularly in defense issues, it's much easier for the United States to think about itself as a partner rather than the kind of the big, the big father, I guess, figure who will take care. So it is a kind of tough love, I think. That's essentially saying it's time to take over these very important matters in your own hands.
I know that you are very close to JD Vance, and I think the way that his rhetoric has been interpreted alongside Donald Trump's is potentially the more measured of the two. You know, the one who kind of comes in and maybe clears up some of the concerns, if you like, that European leaders hear when they hear Donald Trump speak. Is that the role that the two men have decided to take themselves?
Yeah, I don't actually have any insight in whether or not they've formally made an agreement of how they'll speak. But my suspicion is it's probably more reflective of differences in character than assignments of roles. JD is simply, I think he's someone who does tend to be very measured and, highly reflective and intellectual about what he says. And I think the speech he gave the other day in Munich, while I know it was not well received in many quarters. If you read the speech, I think with a degree of fair-mindedness, what you really see that he was saying is that the United States has gone through many of the same issues that Europe is currently going through. It was not an accusatory or a one-sided accusatory statement. It was actually a kind of admission that the United States has struggled with these issues of democracy, free speech, how and in what ways people who seem to be outside the current circle of political acceptability can have their voices heard, and that if they're not heard, can we legitimately be called a democracy? And so it was a real call in some ways for Europe to address those really deep challenges in ways that I think the United States itself is coming to terms with.
Do you think Europe was a bit too quick? Europe and the UK were a bit too quick to have our backs up. Were we too sensitive to criticism?
Yeah, I was actually quite stunned at the at some of the reactions because I guess maybe it's just my own worldview, but I didn't think there was an awful lot that he said that was factually incorrect. In fact, it was. Um, I mean, he was pointing out a number of examples, and maybe those examples seemed less controversial or less settled in the minds of Europe than it did in JD's own mind. But I think he was really trying to say Europe has a real challenge that in terms of how it will incorporate those critiques of its own course, of its leadership, in ways that will show a kind of respect rather than condescension or dismissiveness toward its own citizenry. And again, that's been an issue that we've had in the United States for quite a few years, in which voices that were deemed to be outside the circle of acceptability were rejected, and as a result, I think it just festered and led to a kind of the exactly the outcome here in the United States, which was a fairly significant and as we're now seeing a transformative uh, alteration of the government and the way in which the
Mm.
government of the United States is being run.
I think one of the examples that he picked out, particularly focused on the UK, was about somebody being removed from outside an abortion clinic. And in this country, there are specific rules which mean that women can access abortion treatment without having to be targeted in that way, or to feel like they are targeted in that way. I think that has been interpreted as incorrect from ministers here in the UK government.
I see. The way in which, and this may be differences of coverage or understanding of that particular example, but certainly as it's been discussed and circulated in the United States and then probably in more conservative circles, is that this was a person who was standing outside of a clinic who was silently praying. And so the impression is that something that was in fact causing no demonstrable harm, in fact, now is banned
Yeah.
in England, and so that seems outside the pale of certainly for someone like JD.
You've talked about, Europe being less sort of easy to bruise, and that if, European countries, UK, can't take people's responses to these kind of questions, freedom of speech, more seriously, then they will face a bit of a political reckoning. What's your interpretation of Keir Starmer, new Labour leader in government a couple of months here? I mean, there's a suggestion that he could act as a bridge between Europe and the US when it comes to what happens next, especially around Ukraine. How likely do you think that is from your, view on of Keir Starmer?
Personally, I haven't seen a lot of evidence for the likelihood of a bridge, that kind of a bridge being made. I mean, frankly, I think it would have been probably easier for someone potentially like a Boris Johnson to play that role. Uh, in many ways, I think Starmer, he represents a kind of an alteration of the Labor Party that's not unlike the alteration that happened in the United States with the Democratic Party. I mean, this was literally called the Labor Party, that had lost extensively the support of labor voters in the previous election, or the election before the last, and so much like the United States, the party of the left had really become a very different party, no longer really representing the working class. And so I think to the extent that the current Republican administration is a reflection of a fundamental shift of the left and the right in the United States, it's going to be very difficult for a labor leader to play that role.
If Boris Johnson were brought back in by Labour, which I suspect is incredibly unlikely, but if he were to be, do you think he is somebody that Donald Trump would be willing to deal with?
I think Donald Trump will work with just about anyone. He's he's a negotiator, but I actually think that I agree with you. I don't see any evidence that it's very likely, but I do think it's something that the government should consider. If not Boris Johnson, should consider trying to reach out in a bipartisan way. If that bridge is in fact something the UK would like to be involved in building, which I do think it could play that role.
But just
I
not
think
Keir
it would
Starmer.
be, yeah, but I think it would be probably more effective if it were a bipartisan effort.
Just finally, I mean, there's been a huge amount of criticism of Donald Trump seeking a meeting with President Putin. We expect that will go ahead in Saudi Arabia this week. There is deep concern that Ukraine will be cut out of that meeting, that European leaders will also be cut out of that meeting. I think it's fair to say that Europe and the UK have spent a huge amount of money on defense of Ukraine and have an interest themselves in this negotiation going well. Do you think the Trump team has gone about it in the right way? Because it feels like Ukraine has been cut out of this, and that's obviously created a kickback.
At a deep level, I suspect that Vladimir Putin will only negotiate with the United States. So I think it's less a matter of whether or not Donald Trump is including or not including the right people. I think if there is to be a negotiation settlement of this war, it really has to be a U.S. Russia negotiation. That's not to say that at some point in these negotiations there can't be, and I would anticipate that there will be additional voices. But I think, in some sense, to kick off these negotiations, it really does. This really has been a proxy war between the United States and Russia for all that Europe has done. And I think that's, if this is going to be wound down, it will have to be, at least in the first instance, a negotiation between those two principles.
It doesn't look great, though, does it? It looks like a new American president giving President Putin legitimacy. What he wants.
I suppose that's one way of understanding it. I think another way of understanding it is that Vladimir Putin is a very proud man, and won't negotiate unless, in some sense, his status as a significant world leader is in some ways recognized. So I I certainly understand those criticisms, and it's certainly not outside the realm of strong consideration that there's other ways to go about this. But I do think it is a comprehensible approach from the standpoint of the U.S. president and the leader of Russia.